This week, we flew out to Los Angeles for a sit-down conversation with Dr. Matthew Lieberman. Dr. Lieberman is a neuroscientist who originally trained at Harvard and is one of the world's foremost authorities when it comes to social connection. He later went on to teach at Harvard and published the best-selling book Social, which revealed that our need to connect with other people is more fundamental than even shelter and food. Currently, Lieberman runs a lab at UCLA that tackles the loneliness epidemic by running experiments that aim to turn acquaintances into friends. The importance of this episode cannot be understated, as social connection is essential to our personal well-being. It's estimated that at least 50% of the population experiences loneliness, and many people don't feel they have even one person they can confide in. It's been famously documented that the negative effects from loneliness are like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. While this might seem like an outrageous statement, it's actually true. In this episode, we explore the cause of the loneliness epidemic and what we can do about it. We explore some of the fascinating discoveries in the fields of neuroscience and social psychology and the practical outcomes for what they mean for your social life. But most of all, we get to the root of how we can develop rich and meaningful friendships. So without further adu, Dr. Matthew Lieberman. All right, Matthew, nice name.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I originally read Social a few years ago, and it immediately became one of my favorite books I've ever read. I think there's just so much fascinating research in there that was just incredible. And I think on some level we all know that like we're social animals, but and that's what human connection is a component of our well-being. But after reading that book, it was just like realizing the full extent of it was just like mind-blowing to me, and the difference between us and like other primates and stuff like that was just absolutely incredible. There's this kind of famous saying that you reference in your book that being lonely is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And
Worse. Reliably worse.
And so it seems like, it seems like an outrageous statement when you hear it like in a news article, but it seems like there's a ton of data to support that. And so why is that the case?
Yeah. So first, it's nice to be with you. It's whenever someone tells me they read my book a few years ago, I always have two thoughts. One is, well, you've read it a lot more recently than I have, because I haven't read it since 2012. I finished it, and then okay, it's done. And then the second thought is I remember some of the more personal things I put in there, and I'm like, oh, I thought I was sitting down with a stranger, but you know all sorts of things that a stranger wouldn't know. But with respect to loneliness, there was a study that came out, it's probably 10 years ago or something now, from Holt Lundstedt, where she basically looked at many studies of mostly middle-aged and older adults. And they basically, the whole study was, okay, you register on day one, and at year 5 or year 7, whatever they designed, they check to see if you're still alive. Like, that's it. Like, that's the study. And then what they do is they measure a bunch of things about you to see which of those things predict who is more likely to die during a 5-7 year period, something like that. And so there's this chart you can look at where it lists all these obvious kind of public health, physical health type things: smoking, obesity, getting exercise versus not getting exercise, the air quality where you live. And it will show you the sort of risk that puts you at for dying in that 5-year period over and above someone who doesn't have that same risk factor. And the top of the heap for all of those physical factors is smoking cigarettes. And the way they estimated that was based on 15 cigarettes a day. And then, when I show this, I always show this in my talks, I show that graph. It's a, strong graph. And I talk about, look how much worse smoking is than obesity and so on. And then I reveal that, I haven't shown the top couple bars, and the top couple bars are all related to our social connections. And they are all as bad or worse than smoking. So they compare the risk of dying from smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It is worse if you are socially disconnected. It's a huge factor. And, when I started talking about this, I used to be able to say, well, no one's really even paying attention to that. We spend $500 million a year trying to get people to quit smoking. And at the time, I would say we spend $0 a year trying to get people to quit being lonely, even though it's a worse physical health risk. But, then along came Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, who kind of declared it one of his major priorities for the year. I think maybe a year or two ago. He spent a year kind of really, really promoting that. And, the Surgeon General's job is physical health. It's not mental health. It's not emotional health. It's physical health. But loneliness was a big enough deal that became, his priority for the year.
So obviously they were talking about lifespan, but like just from the work that you've been doing in terms of negative side effects to your life, like what would be the quote unquote cigarette type effect on your life of loneliness, or if you feel lonely?
Yeah. I mean, I think everything gets worse with loneliness. I don't think there's any, at least with smoking, there's some upside. There's no upside to loneliness. So like the obvious things are that you feel lonely, and we all know that feeling lonely is a terrible feeling, just in and of itself. The momentary feeling of, I don't have enough people in my life, or the people I have in my life aren't present in my life in a way that I would like, something like that. But there's also a lot of work showing that loneliness is associated with, changes in cognition and emotional reactions. And those changes, unfortunately, create a bit of a negative spiral where it can make you into someone that it is harder to connect with because of some of the changes that occur. You become needier, you're more prone to anxiety and depression and things like that. Your cognition changes. And so, that makes it even harder to get out of. And, I remember, a period of my life where I was going through that. I'd had a really, really bad breakup and I was spiraling. And you sort of just get into this headspace of, why would anyone ever want to spend time with me? And when you're in that headspace, you kind of become someone where it's easy for other people to say, why would I want to spend time with that person? Like, you really have to have people that care enough about you to help you get yourself out of that spiral and become the person that you're completely capable of being, but you've probably stopped being kind of as you've fallen into that space. And it, took a solid year for me to like get out of that headspace.
Oh. One thing that comes to mind, when you're explaining all this is like, are there caveats? Is it universally true for everyone? I mean, there'd be some people who claim to be independent or self-sufficient. There's like, oh, I'm an introvert. I don't need to really be around people. What would you say about that?
Yeah, there's so many things to say about that. First, nothing is absolutely universal. So it's not like I'm trying to say 8 billion people are the same. And I'm sure there are some degrees of these things, but a lot of the things that we think make someone need other people less don't. So, for instance, in America, we have this, mythology about ourselves that we are, truly independent, sort of the old idea of the Wild West. And like, you go off on your own and you have your farm and your cattle and you don't need other people and nobody tells you what to do. A kind of very libertarian mindset. And study after study shows that while we think of ourselves that way, we are hardly independent of all the social pressures that exist around us. And so mostly what we are is misinformed about ourselves when it comes to that stuff. But then when it comes to introverts and extroverts, a million years ago, before I started doing what I have spent most of my career doing, my dissertation was actually on introversion and extroversion. And so even though this wasn't the focus of my dissertation, I read a lot about introversion, extroversion, studied it. And, the thing about introversion is that I think that they, in a sense, if you think of yourself having kind of I need this many units of social experience in my life, I think introverts and extroverts, they need the same number of units. They just need them in very different kinds of packaging. They need different forms of them. So I am probably more extroverted than my wife. And, the difference between us is that I really enjoy social contact, not always with necessarily like perfect strangers, but people that I don't necessarily have like deep, intense connections with, because I feel like, I get to learn new things about this person. There's always this sense of like possibility and opportunity around someone that you're meeting for the first time or have only talked to a bit, so you know enough to know you kind of like them, but you don't know a lot about them. My wife would rather have, 3 friends who know every single detail about her life. And, we used to go to this sort of adult family summer camp thing with our son. You go for a week, you see the same people every year. And the first day there, you're seeing 100 people that you haven't seen for a year. And you want to talk to every single one of them for 4 minutes just to catch up. And then the whole event kind of really starts because now you've done that. And now you have the real conversations with the people you're more connected to. I think my wife would probably agree that when we were going to this camp, that was the single worst day of her year every year. She despises having small talk with a bunch of people. And that's literally what that entire first day is. Whereas I'm like, hey, I haven't seen you. I haven't seen you. And at the end, I'd be like, that was so nice. And she'd be like, that was terrible.
Yeah.
So
that's really good.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of makes me think, what does lonely even mean? Like, is there a utility to sitting and playing video games and like someone is speaking to over a headset or I think one of the things I learned from some of your latest work is like just how much research there is around about like the deeper you go with somebody, the more like connected you feel. But some people feel very strange or awkward about that, and so can they be connected without being very vulnerable and sharing like deep parts of themselves? Like if they have secrets or other things, are there just people that don't need to be vulnerable? Like, what would you say about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Do people need to be vulnerable? I think there's a lot of people who would say they don't. And then sometimes they're surprised when the opportunity arises in the right setting at how much value there is in that sort of deeper connection. So, along with the introvert extrovert distinction, there's sort of a parallel male female distinction. And, males tend to talk to their friends a lot less about their feelings and things like that. The stuff that creates sort of more disclosure about who you are on the inside. But if they find themselves in that situation, they will often find it more meaningful than a woman would in that same situation, because the woman has had that experience many times in her life. And for men, sometimes I'm actually thinking of a study that we ran last year where we had people either sit in a situation just like this, 2 people talking, but strangers, and they either are kind of induced to have a relatively shallow conversation or they're induced to have a deeper conversation. It's kind of just the questions we give them to sort of talk to each other about. And what we found is that the men benefit from the deeper conversations more than the women. And I suspect it's because it's more novel for them. They report feeling more connected to the other guy that they just talked to more than the women in the same deep condition report feeling more connected to the woman that she just spoke to.
Yeah.
So I do think, and there's some other studies like this in other realms in psychology, where stuff that gets you to go kind of deeper into your feelings, but not in a way that feels against your will, like you're being forced, often has surprising effects. But for whatever reason, men are built that's less of what we tend to do naturally, and we seek it out less.
Yeah. So you have a presence on Twitter when you're speaking, and this difference between male and female is really making me think about this. I don't know if you've seen like the red pill like space.
I know this. My fingers are really close together. But I know this. I don't know very much about that.
And one of those people that's associated with that is Andrew Tate, like a big male influencer. But what's interesting about that space in general is like the way in which we present masculinity and the way in which we present men talking about their feelings. And it's almost like not a masculine thing to talk about your feelings. And so do you feel like when people are saying this, like, do you think they are saying this from a place of like suppressing that like part of that need or their part of themselves? And it's more of like a social contagion of like, we're just going to say that like men don't need to talk about feelings.
I think it's just a bad theory. It's a bad theory that again fits with our sort of culture of independence and, we don't talk. And I think it's a bad theory about the kinds of creatures we are. And so I think it is a mistake. A lot of it has to do with sort of pushing for greater and greater power, and also treating other people more as objects than as people to sort of get to where you want to get to, whether that's with other men in power dynamics or with women in sort of more sexual contexts.
Yeah.
It's just sort of trying to almost dehumanize yourself in order to make yourself into something that appears more powerful to a certain segment.
Yeah. No, that's really good.
Yeah.
And something I want to get to later about like tiers of different friendships. And so
Mhm.
in your Amazon listing on your book, it says our need to connect with other people is even more fundamental, more basic than our need for food and shelter.
Mm.
And then in the book, you added love and belonging might seem like a convenience we can live without, but our biology is built to thirst for connection because it is linked to our most basic survival needs. And
Yeah.
so it's cool because, we're sitting here 10 years later and like you get to reflect on those statements, but like I'm sure those statements surprise like some people. So can you explain to me like the
Sure.
data behind that?
Yeah. So basically what I'm referring to there is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Abraham Maslow was a motivational psychologist back in the 1940s, and he has this, very famous pyramid where he sort of lists the different kinds of needs that humans have with, physical needs, food, shelter, safety, and so on at the bottom. The very top, the pinnacle of the pyramid is self-actualization. And then there's sort of social and self-esteem needs, kind of more psychological needs in the middle. And that's just, it's not like there's data on that, but it's sort of been accepted as a truth. And there's a reason it's been accepted as a truth. It's a pretty compelling idea. Like you need food before these other things. You need these other things before, self-actualization, which is like, you're lucky if you can get that, but that's not essential to living. And if you look at all mammals, not just humans, essentially, if you are not socially connected, you will die. And I'm not talking about later in life and, that kind of study that I was talking about earlier. I'm talking about infancy, right? So for all mammals, mammals are born unable to take care of themselves. And that's not true of many, many other non-mammalian species.
Yeah.
But for mammals, we're basically born helpless, and humans are born like the most helpless of all mammals. Like we really, really need to develop after we're born. We're born too early because of the size of our skulls. And so we're born extra helpless. And this ends up having other benefits in terms of culturalization and things like that, because our brain finishes developing outside the womb instead of in the womb. But as a result, we come out, we're totally, totally helpless. And so if you didn't have caregivers that were like laser focused on your survival because they cared about you, that's how we feel about our progeny, our children. If you're not laser focused on that, your baby's going to die, especially if you go back, even a few hundred years. That's totally going to be true. And so from that perspective, the reason why connection becomes before food and shelter is that it is your points of connection that provide those things to you.
That's good.
So if you lose your connection, you're definitely going to lose your food and shelter as well.
Yeah. I mean, does that change with age?
It's a fair question that I think we don't know definitively the answer to. What I would say is certainly as we age, we are capable of surviving without social contact, and in a state of loneliness. We can at that point have jobs where we never have to interact with another person, right? You could have remote work where you're shifting numbers around and you have no contact with other people, and you have food delivered and you can have clothes delivered and you pay your, rent by Venmo or whatever it is. Like you could do that and you could survive. I suspect even then you would have all sorts of simulated experiences of social connection through the media that you consume, through books, through other things. But let's say you even got rid of that. Could you survive without all those things? I think you could. Would it feel like you were living a good life?
No.
Probably not.
No.
But then, things do happen. A piece of the reason why people die who aren't socially connected, there's deep health reasons why people are more likely to die. There's things about your immune system that change. Your immune system tunes itself to how socially connected you are. My wife actually has a big theory about that that's pretty interesting. But the other thing is that if you break your leg, the only way you're getting to the hospital is if someone else takes you, right? So and this happens all the time. I mean, it's a horrible thing.
In war, too.
But
yeah.
people, die at home alone and nobody notices for weeks or longer because that person was just totally shut off. And if they weren't, maybe someone would have come and seen that they were sick or hurt or whatever it was.
It's a really good way of putting it. I mean, what do you think, like attachment? I mean, a lot of what you're alluding to is like, attachment theory and some of the mechanisms that are developed like out of, birth. So where do you think that ranks in importance in terms of being able to understand human connection?
I think attachment is hugely important. So attachment theory, is basically the idea that we are wired both as sort of parents and children, sort of in this circuitry that sort of binds them together that basically causes the parent to make sure the child is safe and allows the child to feel safe enough that it can sort of explore within reason while still feeling safe. Like if I know my mother is within visual distance of me, I can go play over here and I'm not worried. It's a good idea to worry about all of the unknown in general, but it's also a good idea to say, well, that person's looking out for me, so I can go over here a bit and they're going to sort of make sure that everything is taken care of. And so that is, an evolutionary hardwired thing into all mammals, is some kind of attachment. Certainly all primates have I think a strong attachment process as far as I know. Attachment's not my sort of main area of expertise at all. So yeah, I think it's a really essential part of understanding what a human being is. If you came down as an alien and you wanted to understand human beings, you would absolutely not understand humans if you did not understand attachment.
That's really good. Yeah, because you talked about it quite a bit in your book, and I think that like a lot of people, if they study attachment theory, you have the understanding of the parent-child relationship, then you have the understanding of the romantic sexual relationship, and then how deeply does attachment apply to friendships and loneliness, like what we're talking about?
So the complicated part of attachment is that when we study attachment in infants and small children, we study it behaviorally. So we set up situations like the strange situation where you do certain things and you see how the child reacts to the mother not being in the room or the mother being in the room while certain other things happen. And you look for a certain behavioral response. When you start to look at attachment in the context of like adult romantic relationships, the problem is that at that point, you're not actually focused on behavioral evidence of what happened in infancy. Like as an infant, you are wired with certain kinds of sensitivities that predispose you to be a securely attached infant, an anxiously attached infant, an avoidantly attached infant. And then we've ported that into talking about adults, but the way we talk about in adults is we just ask the adults questions, and then they tell us their theory of themselves. And their theory might be very good, but I also had a theory when I was in grad school, when I was studying introversion, that I was an introvert. And I remember this very distinct time. I had this friend, he was French. His name was Guy, or I guess it would be Guy in France, but Guy. And I told him, this is what I studied. And I told him I was an introvert. And he literally punched me in the arm and said, you're not an introvert. Like, you can have a really bad theory of yourself based on things that you prioritize or some earlier experience that taught you the wrong lesson about yourself. So, when it comes to, I think, adult attachment, whether it's romantic or friendship, I do think those same elements are there. I don't know to what extent, though, what you're looking at is personality, what you're looking at is physiology, or what you're looking at is kind of just like a history of romantic or friendship experiences that taught you about the world, that like friends can be trusted or friends can't be trusted.
Yeah.
And people are going to learn different lessons during their formative years. And that's going to produce effects that kind of look like attachment, but maybe aren't the same thing as what we mean by infant attachment. But I think there are important individual differences. And, knowing how someone was with their last multiple relationships or friendships is going to tell you something about how they are likely to be with you.
Yeah.
But then things also change. And I think that like my own attachment, to the extent that I'm aware of it, I think changed from before I was with my wife till after. She would have described, and she has done attachment theory related work. She would have described my attachment one way when we met, and she would, I think, describe it very differently now. And I think that just sort of speaks to the fact that we are who we are because of who we're with in the world. And if somebody else is a constant in your life, they can be a constant thing that modulates the kind of person you are. I suspect if we weren't together, I would probably maybe not revert 100%, but a fair bit.
Yeah. No, that kind of alignment of some understanding that I've developed over the past couple of years. Because initially, when I had looked into attachment theory and done a lot of work, studying that, it like you could kind of think of it as this kind of monolithic thing, and in the sense that like you could if you're on a dating app, you could tell if someone probably is anxious, avoidant, some mix of that, if they're secure, whatever. So you could really tell, and you're like, okay, so it does speak to an aspect of the human experience. It's kind of it's like a fact, in a sense, and then but it doesn't speak to the fullness of that. And so, we had like a sex scientist on here and talking about like the role that attachment plays, but then there's like these other components, and then like you're saying, you have attachment, and then there's kind of these other components maybe that would influence the way you react in your social relationship. So it's just one piece of the equation to kind of be aware of.
There was this professor, Paul Rosen, I think he was at University of Pennsylvania, and I saw him give a talk when I don't even know if I was a professor yet, but it was very, very early on in my career. And he was sort of talking about sort of hot trends in psychology and neuroscience. And he sort of went through all these trends going back into like the 70s. And he would sort of put up the buzzword and he would say, the promise is this thing is going to explain 100% of our problems. And, 10, 15 years later, we all know it explains much, much less. And he just did this with every single trend that had come up. And so I think that there is a tendency to think whatever the sort of latest and greatest big ideas are going to explain everything. AI is going to explain everything now. And it's like, no, it will add something really important to our lives, just like everything that came before it. But it never explains everything. It never replaces everything. It just adds to the sort of complex mush that goes all together.
Yeah. So, I mean, attachment is like painting part of the picture, but like so much of the other scientific findings, like in your book and discoveries and some of the studies you've done were just incredible. One of the things that really struck me was, if you're listening to this and you're feeling like, no, but I still don't really need to be connected. I'm very independent. The stuff around our default network and social cognition was just blew my mind. So can you explain to the audience what that is?
Yeah. So we have different networks in the brain. Think of them as kind of the way we think about alliances, right? So like we have NATO, which is an alliance between the United States and Europe, and we think of them as somehow being kind of closer in some sense than other, parts of the world. And different regions of your brain have that as well. They have sort of stronger connections so that information travels between them, and they tend to work together in units. So there's a series of networks, and one of them that was discovered in the late 90s was called the default mode network. And it was discovered in a very weird accidental way, as interesting scientific findings often happen. I forget who said it, but someone said, the best scientific findings almost never come from someone uttering, just as I expected. It's always, that's funny. That's where great findings come from. And so the scientist at Washington University, this is very, very early on in neuroimaging days. So, people only had a handful of neuroimaging data sets. They were super expensive to collect. And so this group at Washington University, they had more than most. And so they had these, I think it was 8 or 9 studies that all looked at different aspects of visual processing, cognitive things like reading and math and other things that were pretty different. And they said, let's see if there's anything common to all of those things. If we take all of those studies and kind of treat them as one big study, is there anything that comes out when we look at the data as if it's true no matter which of those cognitive things you're doing? And they got a little stuff, but there really wasn't much that was interesting in there. And then someone said, hey, for each of these studies, we always compare the thing we care about, like doing a math problem, to a period of time when a person's just sitting in the scanner doing nothing at all. And so we get our data by saying how much higher does the signal go when someone's doing math compared to when they're doing nothing, or when they're looking at a house compared to when they're doing nothing. And somebody in that group said, hey, what if just for fun, we look at the opposite and see if there are any regions of the brain that are consistently more activated whenever people are doing nothing than when they're doing any of these different things that we have them do in these 9 studies. And they got this map of, it kind of looks like a Star Trek spaceship in the brain, where you have this sort of region in the center front of the brain. And then you have these sort of 2 wings kind of right behind where your ears are. And then there's a place in the middle if you went between those 2 spots behind your ears. And there's some other spots too, but those 4 kind of define this region. And they had no idea what this network did. And it got called the default mode network because it just came on by default whenever you stopped doing other stuff. And so it became this big mystery, the sort of, I think the person who discovered it, or one of them, referred to it as the dark matter of the brain. Like, why would this network come on when internally nothing is going on? Part of the problem is that we tend to confuse what we tell a person to do while they're laying in the scanner with what they're actually doing while they lay in the scanner. So I can tell you just rest and do nothing, but anyone who has tried meditation knows sitting and doing nothing leads your brain to do all sorts of things.
Yeah, it's hard.
And so eventually we started to figure out that what we figured out is that there were other studies being done that would show that same network turning on in other contexts. So people didn't know what it was doing during rest. That's something that I kind of feel like my lab contributed a lot to. But before that, there were a bunch of studies that showed that if you get a person to think about another person's mind, this same network would come on compared to when they would think about an object, a physical object. So if you thought about something that had a mind and you thought about the, things that were in that mind, you would get this same default mode network coming on relative to when you thought about a shoe or a rock or something like that. Same thing would happen, slightly different process, when you would think about yourself. And of course, you have a mind. So when you think about yourself, you're often thinking about your own thoughts and concerns and worries and so on, your own plans for the future, memories of the past, and so on. And so it started to look like, there's this pattern we get while people are doing nothing. And there's this pattern we get when people think about minds, whether it's their own and other minds. So maybe that's what this network is doing when you are at rest. But for some reason, nobody ever thought to look at what the mind was actually doing during rest. They looked at it in other contexts and then inferred. And so back around, 2013 or so, I think we were collecting the data when I wrote the book. So I think when I wrote the book, I was hoping the data would come out. And I can't even remember now. It's been so long since I've read the book, whether I knew what the data looked like when I finished writing the chapter on this. But it was one of the few times in my career where the data actually came out the way I predicted and have replicated several times since. That's only happened a few times. And so what we found is if you look at someone while they're doing nothing in the scanner during rest, and you looked at how strongly that network came on, sometimes it comes on really strongly, sometimes it comes on less strongly, sometimes very little at all. So you could have these different levels with which this network came on. And then we would surprise people with either doing a task right after that, where they either had to think about another person's mind or think about something physical. And it turned out that the extent to which you turned on that default mode network while you were ostensibly doing nothing predicted how well you would do on that task that came right after it, but only if that task was social, not if you were focused on something physical, not if you were thinking about math. It was only if you were thinking about minds or had to think about minds to do that next task. And so that was our first, I think, really direct clue that this network that comes on every time you're at rest, it's very what we refer to as metabolically expensive, right? So your brain uses about 20% of the calories in your body. So it's using up a huge energy budget. So to have this network come on every time you're doing nothing, it better be doing something important, right? Because like the brain doesn't sort of just evolve to waste its energy. It's super careful with its energy budget in terms of our evolutionary history. And so it seems like the thing that our brain evolved to devote kind of extra cycles to was processing the social world. That's the thing. It doesn't practice getting better at math and other things. It seems to be predisposed to practice and enhance our understanding of the social world. And some studies that my then graduate student, Megan Meyer, did, she's now a professor at Columbia University, she did these really, really great studies following up on this initial idea where she exposed people to either a bunch of social information where you would learn about a bunch of people, their professions, their personality, and so on, or you would learn about a bunch of like physical destinations. Like, so there's Bora Bora, this is what it looks like, here's the climate, here's a place in Russia, here's what it looks like, here's some features of it physically. She would just show them this for several minutes. I think it was about 25 minutes. And then after that, she would just tell people to rest. You don't have to do anything during those 8 minutes, just lay there and rest. And then at the end of those 8 minutes, maybe it was actually much later than that, I think it was a half hour later, there would then be a memory test. And what she found is that the more your default mode network sort of showed integrated activity during that 8-minute rest, the better your memory was for the social stuff, but not for the physical stuff. So that suggests that we have these social experiences, and then what our brain does during downtime is it says, okay, let me get my arms around that and figure out how to integrate that into what I already know. Like what I really suspect, and we've never done this study, but what I really suspect the default mode network is doing is updating very slightly all the parameters for kind of our understanding of the rules of the social world in specific contexts and in the context in general. So you finish high school, you go to college, and suddenly now the rules are different in terms of like what kind of behavior is going to be rewarded and get you excluded and so on. And so you have these experiences that give you hints of like what's going to be acceptable and not. And then that's got to be integrated with the 18 years of social knowledge you already have. And I think that that is what the default mode network is probably doing when you're not paying attention and doing anything else, when you're just sort of zoning out. I think it's basically making you socially smarter so that the next time you go back to that same context, you now have a better intuitive sense of how to behave in that context.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I mean, because there are so many parallels you would talk about, like humans, and then how this might be for primates or what, or other primates. And so it's amazing that like, when we're sitting there doing nothing, it's like the first thing that like pops into our mind is, thinking about our other people and just our place in the social world and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I mean, you wrote in the book, you said there are so many other things our brain could have been built to spend its spare time on, like learning calculus, improving our logical reasoning ability. So it's just like you could be thinking out so many things, but your brain is like defaulting to just think about. And I when I read that, I was like, I could really appreciate that experience. It's like, okay, I'm working, and then I just stop and I'm resting. I'm like, oh, start thinking about my family, or start thinking about my friends, or start like so.
And that's, I mean, one of the sort of upshots is I remember learning, maybe it was at the end of grad school, that the content of our dreams kind of covers the same themes with the same proportions as what we experience during our waking life. That it's actually like it's weird and warped in certain ways, but like the frequency of people occurring and other things are pretty similar between dreams and the waking state. And I think the thoughts we have when we're sort of just in our own heads versus the conversations we have with other people are both heavily weighted towards social topics. It's what's natural, I think, for us to think about, especially if you include kind of self-related stuff as part of the social world. And I could spend a few hours explaining why every thought you have about yourself is secretly a conversation with all the important people in your life, because that's what your sort of sense of self is it's sort of the echo of what they said you should be when you were growing up and things like that. So I think it's actually a sort of surprisingly social process that we're just not really terribly aware of. But if you include all that, when we gossip with people at work, it's 70% social and self-related stuff. And I think the percentage is probably roughly the same when we're just on our own thinking. It's
yeah. It makes me think about there's a part in your book where you're talking about like it seems that when we are learning new information, we're simultaneously trying to figure out how we could share that information with other people.
Yeah.
Which really highlights the loneliness thing, because it's like if you're like, oh my God, I just watched this movie or I just learned this thing, and like your first instinct is like, I want to share this with other people and like talk about it. Oh, I don't have anybody to talk about with this.
Right.
It's like, it's like you're hitting up against a wall about something that's just like true about you and just so innate,
It's an interesting thing that very, very few people, fewer people are going to movies in general, but very few people go to movies alone. Very few people go travel alone. Like, ultimately, why is that? Like, I mean, I get that there's like some practical advantages to sort of doing those things together, but it's like, I want to see a movie. Well, if I don't have anyone to see it with, I'm just not going to go see it in the theater. I really want to see it in the theater. It's a movie that's going to look really good on the big screen, but I'm not going to go because A, it just sort of feels weird, but why does it feel weird? And I think a big part of each of these experiences is having someone built in to talk about that experience with as soon as it's over. So yeah, it's, we didn't have to be built that way, but we definitely are built that way.
Yeah, that's cool. Another one that kind of paints this picture is there was multiple studies that you highlighted done on the value of kind words and positive affirmation in people. And so like basically one of them was talking about how like you put somebody in a scanner and then they would read off like positive affirmations from people. And just the value of that, value of kind words and affirmation in proportion to like the way that we value money. So I'm just like, this is like mind blowing to me.
Sorry. At first I'm not someone who's like really big on like gratitude journaling and things like that. So I thought that's where you were going, but now I know the studies you're talking about. So, there were, I guess it was around 2008, a series of papers came out. One of them was ours, but I think some of the other ones were better papers. And they would have you get in the scanner and you would think that you were somehow connected to 3 other people. You never met them. Maybe you saw a picture of their face. I can't remember for sure if you actually saw a picture of them. In the study, you could see a picture of the 4 faces. But it was really just you. You just thought there were other people. And at certain points throughout the game, other people would provide verbal feedback about you. And so they were able to compare the effects of sort of having moderately nice things said about you from strangers to having money put in your account. And basically the key finding is the exact same region of the brain that responds to all the sort of biggest, what we think of as physical rewards in the world, whether it's money, which isn't actually a physical reward, but we tend to think of it that way. Money, delicious food, for someone who's a drug addict.
So it's like dopamine.
Yeah. Well, so dopamine is misunderstood
Yeah.
a whole bunch, but I'll say reward, and I'll say the part of the brain, part of the brain called the ventral striatum, responds very, very strongly to these cues. And it turned out that getting these sort of vague, I mean, they really, if you go look at the original study, the words are things like "you're pleasant," "you're polite." They're not like "you're brilliant," "you're gorgeous." They're very, very modest compliments, and they produce the same amount of reward signal in the ventral striatum as getting whatever amount of money that they were looking at.
That's crazy.
Yeah, my wife had a paradigm where she would give people the opportunity to get notes from loved ones, where she literally would start the study by saying, give us the names of like 5 people in your life. And then her graduate student, who's now a professor, Tristan Inagaki, Tristan would write to all those people and say, write me a letter about this person showing how much you sort of love and care, and just be specific. And so they were able to look at the reward response of having someone sort of express the degree to which they love you. And it produced, a huge reward response. We did a behavioral study in my lab using that same paradigm where we had people winning money throughout the game. And you could basically, at the end of the game, you could trade all that money to get 3 of those letters. And virtually everyone said, take the money, I want the letters.
Wow.
Right. So these are college students saying, don't give me the $30, don't give me the $40, give me the letter from my grandma, my best friend, and, somebody else who said really nice things about me and why I'm important to them, and so on. People really, really sort of value that. And, if you think about it, it sort of seems obvious, like this is part of why we want money and so on, is to be able to facilitate those other relationships. But it always seems like the physical stuff is more fundamental than the psychological stuff, the social stuff. But again and again, the evidence from our brain tells us, not so fast.
Yeah.
Your theory of yourself isn't that great.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all that data, is just so incredible in terms of painting the picture of how we need connection, how we think about connection, how connection's innate, how we need love. But one thing that's interesting is, it's not like this is so baked into us, but it's not like this like harmonious thing that's going on, in the sense that like we crave connection, yet it also seems to be such a struggle. And so like, I don't necessarily say the same thing about other biological processes about the world. Like this thing, the connection seems to be such a struggle for people.
Yeah.
How do you feel like the changes in the modern age have like affected social connection? Has it disrupted kind of more of an ancient like history we have that was kind of more harmonious when it comes to social connection? What would you say about that?
So I think of a lot of things. In the metaphor I use in my head a lot is like leveling up in a video game, like an RPG game or something like that, where it's like you get to something, you get some new sort of level for your hero or whatever, you have some new armor or something like that, and now you have new capabilities, but now you're at a level where everything's harder, right? And so everything ends up being needed for whatever level you're at. I think that lives were a lot simpler 1,000 years ago. They were also shorter, and people died for no good reason. But typically, if you were growing up in medieval Europe, you basically knew everyone you were going to know by the time you were 5. And the only new people you were going to know is people who hadn't been born yet, right? So you lived in a small village. If you were going to get married, you already knew that person. That was the whole community. And so it wasn't that complex. Human beings also, there's a good argument to suggest that human beings themselves were less complex then than they are now. Roy Baumeister has this amazing book, I think he wrote it in 86, called Identity, where he basically makes this argument that the human self, the construct that is our self, is fundamentally different now because of all the choices that we have in the modern world, and that each choice you make actually expands what it is that you call yourself. And so if you're in medieval Europe, you had this little tiny self because there were no choices to be made. Your profession was predetermined. Whether you were getting married was predetermined. You didn't pick a religion. You didn't pick you didn't pick a college. You didn't pick a profession. All those things were predetermined. Now we have endless choice, which is also why we have a lot more anxiety. All right. So in terms of our social relationships, the most complicated thing we know of in the universe is another person, right? You could do so many things that I could never predict right now. And somehow I'm sitting here and this is all sort of civil and fine, but like, this could be a murder plot, right? Like it could be so many different things. You could actually be here to sell me Tupperware. It could be that he's not actually recording right now. And there's all this complexity that we don't have with any other physical object that we ever deal with. So navigating that and developing a relationship, a friendship where you have some sense of like trust and safety and so on, like that is a miraculous event at any point in human history. Evolutionary psychologists have argued for years and years whether the idea of friendship makes any evolutionary sense. Because, if we become friends, like we don't share genes. My genes are all about replicating themselves. It turns out people who become friends tend to actually have more similar genes, even if they're not like related in a sense of like, I know we're cousins or something like that. But that aside, there's this process where you have to come to trust something that is so uncertain and indeterminate. So technology has done all sorts of things because technology allows us to move and live in different places, right? So everybody stayed where they were when they were young. And as a result of staying in a small village, you saw the same people over and over and over again. So you got to see with your own eyes their behavioral tendencies. Were they nice to other people? Were they trustworthy with other people before you committed to anything with them? And now right now you are, and I live 3,000 miles from where I grew up, right? All the people that I consider my friends that I see on some regular basis are people that I met as an adult. I didn't get to see them and all those tendencies and so on. So technology allowed us to move great distances in short periods of time. And now technology is really modulating the way in which we connect and stay connected with other people. When I moved out here, my entire family was on the East Coast. Now a lot of my family is on the West Coast. But when we had our son back in 2007, Facebook and FaceTime were hugely important in terms of having my son have a connection with his grandparents who were not nearby. Like it was a huge factor in that. And it allows people to stay connected in a way that is not the same and perfectly as good as being face-to-face and doing things together. It's not the same as that, but it is vastly, vastly better than the alternative of not being able to be connected with those folks, which might have been the case if you, a couple hundred years ago said, I'm moving out west. That was probably the last time you ever had any contact. Maybe you could send a letter back at some point. And it would, in 2 months, you'd get a letter back or something like that. Yeah. But it's really, really changed that. And so, I text with my parents all the time. They probably wish I did it more. But, to me, it feels like a fair bit of time. And so I have this contact that's a different form than, the other types of contact you might have. But it's still sort of allowing easier and easier sort of integration with other people, even when they're not physically present.
Yeah. I mean, I think the byproduct of that, it really is the depth of the relationships. Mm-hmm. And so it's like we have this whole digital realm, social media, and we could be texting people from 3,000 miles away. But at the crux of it, deeper, meaningful connections are really what helps eradicate the loneliness epidemic at some level. Yeah. And so one of the recent guests on our podcast was Arthur Brooks. I don't know if you know. So he's a social scientist, teaches a class in Harvard on happiness. Yep. wrote a book last year on it. And so friendship
Mhm.
is one of his big 4 pillars of happiness.
Yep.
And he said there were 3 levels of friendship. When we posted a clip on this on social media, it completely blew up. And I suspect it's probably because of how much people are related to this. But and this kind of illustrates where the problem lies, is that he said there is a kind of a friendship of transaction, which is kind of you're directly benefiting off the relationship, work, stuff like that. And people can appreciate that, especially in, I live in New York City, we're in LA. Like that's you just feel like you're either hustling or you're trying to, someone's hustling you in
Right.
terms of like what they can get out of you. And I feel like a lot of people feel that. And so you're at work or other things. And then he talked about the friendship of beauty, which is like when you're around somebody like magnetic, or you admire them for some reason. And famous people really came to mind for me, is like people just like want to be around them.
Yep.
And then he talked about the friendship of virtue, which he said are the kind of relationships that have a lot of depth, that truly satisfy. And he called them like useless, in the sense that like there's no utility, in the sense of like, I'm not trying to get something out of you. I'm just loving you from you. I'm being there for you.
They're only useful in terms of they make life worth living.
Yeah. And so obviously with all the work you've done over the past 25 years, I kind of wanted to see like what your opinion was on those buckets.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I do follow some of his work. I haven't actually heard that. That didn't blow up and reach me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess the labels don't quite resonate for me, the virtue and but I mean, I think that certainly we have friendships that, fill different buckets for us. We have different buckets at the same level. And sometimes the relationships we have change buckets over time because we accidentally sort of get deeper with them. I think friendship is a combination of sometimes utility, but I think a big part of it, and a lot of the work I do these days, is focused on the extent to which you sort of share ways that you see the world. And I think that sort of defines a lot of basic compatibility, the way you see the world. And then on top of that, you have to have circumstances. So our closest friends are almost always people that we've gone through things with. And it could be that like they've gone through something and you're the person who's really there with them. But whether it's nursing someone through a breakup, or grieving the death of a loved one, or helping them out of one of those really lonely periods or something like that, I think that's often what allows someone to transcend into that sort of very, very special category. And yeah, I think most people, there are surveys suggesting that a very large percentage of people don't have someone like that currently. And in the 70s, they were much more likely to report having someone like that in their life. So that's I think a pretty big problem. But even if you have someone, most people, you only have room. I think of those as more existential friends. And I think that you only have room for so many people in that bucket, because you can only kind of give a small number of people kind of access to all of you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, part of it is like, I feel like almost a skepticism that in the modern world that's even possible to find people like that. And in the sense that like, I'd imagine some of the influence of the loneliness epidemic is like this chronic feeling of feeling everybody's out for themselves, and so then you kind of have to feel like you have to be out for yourself in terms of the world, and you had talked about this in terms of being self-interested versus like reaching out to people and stuff like that. So
yeah, I mean, we again, one of the themes that comes up in that book frequently, and in social psychology in general, I think, is that we kind of have bad theories of ourselves and our psychological makeup. That's why social psychology exists. It's trying to get a better evidence-based theory of that. And so there is this idea that everyone is just self-interested, and that every act can be traced back to someone strategically doing something to benefit themselves, even if they're playing a long game. Even if I'm tipping the waiter to create a certain appearance with someone I'm on a date with, and I want to give a big tip so they think I have lots of disposable income and I spend it freely, and I'm trying to create that impression or something like that. We think a lot of the time that that's what motivates everyone. But it turns out that there's pretty good evidence that that's not the way people operate. And I think part of the root of that is that we are built to take care of other people. If you go back 1,000 years, you were either being taken care of as a very small child or you were involved in taking care of others.
Hmm.
We have this ever-growing kind of adolescence and now young adulthood where you're responsible to no one but yourself. But if you go back 1,000 years ago, 13, you're having children, right? You're an adult, you're providing. And so there wasn't this big window of teenage years where it's just like, just grow and find out who you are. I think the whole grow and find out who you are sort of occurs in this weird vacuum, because I think who we are creatures that are supposed to be taking care of each other. And so I think it's weird. I think it's now gone from, it went from 13 to 19, the teenage years. I think it's now more like 13 to 28 or something like that. So I think that's one issue, is that I think that distorts some of our natural tendencies to be told, be more selfish, find yourself, do what you need to do. And it's almost cutting yourself off from the thing that naturally, I think, more tends to define who we are. When I got married and had a son, my life became so much simpler because I knew I had a motivational map of exactly what mattered to me and what I was here to do. Made my life so much clearer. I had so much anxiety over what should I be doing in my life until that moment. And then it's like, oh, that's obvious. Why didn't someone tell me this before? All you have to do is, have a kid and care about them, and you're going to have really clear plans for what to do.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, and this shows up clearly in the sort of online dating world, is the problem of too many choices. Humans are not really built to have endless choices. And when we have sort of endless access to more and more people, we tend to devalue what's in front of us because we always think what's behind door number 2 could be better. Right.
Yeah.
Well, FOMO, but just also like there's better stuff out there. And so maybe I should keep looking. And so we leave behind, not only leave behind, but we just don't invest. And so, to get that depth with another human being, you have to give it. You have to disclose. And to want to disclose, you have to say, I'm disclosing to this person because I think this person could be a forever person, whether it's a friend or a romantic relationship. And I think it's become a lot harder. If you grew up in a village and you were, heterosexual, you were a heterosexual boy, and there's, 4 guys and 4 girls in your village, it's like, okay, which of those 4? Like, is there compatibility with one of those 4? And if so, I better marry them because that's it. That's all there is, right? That really focuses and narrows you in on things. Whereas now you can swipe, I don't even know if it's right or left, but you swipe one way or the other forever. And there's always going to be someone better, I guess. But yeah, each one at a sort of shallower level.
Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons of each approach, and so some people are like, "Oh, arranged marriage would be terrible" or something like that, and at some level, it's like because it feels like restrictive, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. Doesn't necessarily have to be terrible. Maybe it's the anxiety that you feel about all the choices that are available to you just makes life simpler, and so you're just talking about a different world. But I think a lot of the research you've been doing lately is pretty incredible because we have this advent of technology and trying to figure out how to use apps and things like that in like a very redemptive manner, in a way that, we understand the science, we understand some of these underlying mechanisms, and how can we actually use that for good. And so one of the things that I found to be amazing was neural synchrony.
Yep.
And so and the role in that and deeper connection. And so can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So that's really been a big part of my obsession for the last, 7, 8 years now. I hint at it in the like prologue of the book, the last 2 pages of the book. I talk a little bit about this, and then it became kind of my whole career after the book came out. So neural synchrony is a basic kind of physiological thing in the brain. So right now we're having this conversation, or let's say we both spent time watching him out in the booth right there, and we just stare at him for the next 5 minutes. Whatever he does, he starts juggling or whatever it is, and we watch him So we're both taking in the same visual information, roughly speaking, and then we can go look at different parts of the brain, and we can look at the extent to which your brain and my brain are kind of doing the same thing over time, right? So you've got that sort of ticker.
So you're in sync.
You're in sync in a particular part of the brain, and it turns out that this is a very, very different way to think about the brain, because usually what we do is we just average over long periods of time and just say, is the brain more active when you see a house than a face? But it doesn't show you kind of what's happening in the sort of second-to-second changes. But what's also really, really interesting that Yuri Hassan, he's a psychologist at Princeton, he largely figured out that what causes, I'll just call it synchrony from now on, but it's neural synchrony. It's actually interpersonal neural synchrony is the full name for it, but I'm just going to call it synchrony. When you have synchrony in different regions of the brain, it means different things psychologically. So if you go look at the very earliest point in the back of your brain that processes visual information, what you're seeing with your eyes, you'll get synchrony if you and I are watching him juggle out there. He's very good, by the way.
Yeah.
If you're watching him juggle, we will have lots of synchrony in this region called V1. It's the very first visual region in the back of the brain. We could take the video of him juggling or talking to someone else, and we could play it in reverse, and we both watch it in reverse. And we will have lots of synchrony in V1, because all V1 cares about are kind of the physical light patterns hitting your eye in terms of, line orientations and very simple parts of the visual field. And it doesn't care if those are playing forwards or backwards, or if you take the video and you splice it up into little chunks and rearrange them, as long as when we look at the data later, we rearrange it back into the original order. You can take someone who watched a minute of something normally and somebody who watched it all broken up into chunks and reversed into all sorts of different spots, and we can see the synchrony in V1, because all it cares about is the low-level visual information. But if you go to the default mode network, which we talked about earlier, and particularly the spots that are behind your ears and the spots in the back middle part of the brain, if you go there and we play the video backwards, you won't get synchrony. But if you play it forwards, you will. So what's different about forwards versus backwards is that when it's forwards, there's coherent meaning to what's being done. People interact in coherent, sort of just naturally coherent ways. And so you can watch a video of something and there's a sense of what the underlying story is, what people are thinking, what they're motivated by, all sorts of social factors. And when you play it backwards, none of that makes sense anymore. If you take that video and you splice it up into 4-second chunks, you won't get any neural synchrony in that region, which is called TPJ, temporoparietal junction, the part that's right behind your ears. You won't see the synchrony there unless it's sort of clear that the meaning, the story arc can be extracted. It doesn't have to be an hour of story to get synchrony there. You can start to see it with clips, I think, as short as maybe 12 seconds, definitely 30 seconds, and definitely like 2, 4, 6 minutes, things like that. And so what this suggests to me is that this region is sensitive to how you are kind of intuitively experiencing the world in terms of its kind of basic meaning, and how you sort of subjectively construe the world. And the subjective part ends up being really, really important, because there are times where you and I can look at the exact same visual video clip with sound, and it's played forward for both of us, and we won't necessarily show any synchrony with each other in this TPJ region at all. Because there are times where we look at the exact same thing and see completely different things. And the most obvious example of this is, show a Trump ad or a Kamala Harris ad to folks, and they're all getting the same, stuff hitting their eyeballs and their earballs, but they will experience it radically different depending on their own politics and ideology. And this is the region of the brain that will reflect that. So the Democrats will all show synchrony with each other in TPJ when they watch Trump ads, and the Republicans will all show synchrony with each other in TPJ when they watch a Trump ad. But the Democrats and Republicans will show very little synchrony with each other in that same region because they're seeing and experiencing this differently, which for me has led me to think that this is kind of our best guess as to where sort of conscious subjectivity lives in the brain, the thing that causes us to have a private, particular, idiosyncratic experience of the world. And this kind of synchrony study, I think, can reveal that.
Do you feel, so let's just say I've saw on your website, you have these things that have hooked up people's heads. Like if I'm quote unquote in sync with you, right?
Yep.
Do the people are like, I feel that right now. I feel that connection with you, that those two ranges are now in sync.
So
in like a positive way,
so they might.
Psychological.
So they might. I think when you're talking face to face, you might well sort of have an intuitive sense. But I can sort of show, I'll refer to my colleague's study, Carolyn Parkinson at UCLA. She did, the study that really, really blew my mind. It came out in 2018. This was the synchrony study that made me realize, like, this is what I want to study all the time now. And I was lucky enough to have her as a colleague at UCLA. So she looked at people who weren't interacting at all. So she brought in folks. She was a grad student at Dartmouth. And so she did a collaboration with someone at the business school, at Tuck Business School. And they brought in, when the new wave of first-year MBAs showed up, very early on, she got them into the MRI scanner, a cohort of them, maybe 40 of them, and she had them watch a series of videos. I think they watched some stupid cat videos, an Obama video, soccer videos, like just a variety of things while they were in the scanner. And then she also found out which of them were friends in real life, which of them were friends of friends, and which of them were further distant than that, strangers, essentially. But their friendship status had nothing to do with what they did when they came in and laid in the scanner. They just laid in the scanner and watched these videos. So there's no feeling of connection with anyone. But what she found is that in this TPJ region that I was talking about earlier, the more you and I laying in the scanner, each on our own, the more we show a more similar pattern in that region when we are watching all these different types of videos, the more likely we are to end up being real friends in real life.
How do you define real friends?
So both of us would basically have to privately identify the other person as a friend. So it's not enough for me to say, yeah, we're friends, and then you don't. So we both have to nominate each other in this process that they use. It's a social network method where you map out your network and say who are the people you're friends with and so on. And so you could predict reliably who were friends in real life based on, as far as I'm concerned, who was seeing these videos in more similar ways. And then a year or two ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, a study came out of China where they looked at married couples. And they basically showed that you could predict your level of marital satisfaction from the extent to which you and your partner showed synchrony when watching videos, both that were about marriage and other videos that weren't about marriage. So, that's not about the feeling you have when you're with the person. That's just an independent indicator that you are likely to get along with this person and probably have some of those feelings when you do interact with them.
Yeah.
But that's not what's driving the neural signal.
What I feel like people would probably be most interested in is like what would actually promote, what types of activities socially or that you're doing, what would actually promote that or cause that to activate so that we are in synchrony. I mean, that's like the big thing,
So this is very complicated. So as you mentioned, we do these studies now in my lab using a very different technology. So for 20 years, my lab primarily used magnetic resonance imaging. That's the giant sort of donut that you go lay in. It makes loud noises. It takes pictures of your brain. You have to be alone in there. You have to lay very still. You can't speak. And starting around 2015, my lab has increasingly started using another technology called near-infrared spectroscopy, or functional near-infrared spectroscopy. So we call it FNIRS. Instead of MRI or fMRI, we do FNIRS. And FNIRS is a rig that you can essentially, it's like a cap that you wear. We could both be wearing them right now, and it measures the same signal that an MRI does, but in a pretty simplistic way. It's the same thing as a pulse oximeter that you put on your finger at the doctor's to see what your blood oxygen level is. And it's basically taking blood oxygen level measurements of your brain. And by seeing where certain changes occur, we know that that was preceded by neural activity in that region. So this technology has lots of downsides, but the great thing is that if you really care about the social brain, it allows you to look at people doing genuinely social things that we were never able to really do before. So we could easily be doing this interview with both of us wearing it. We could both wear them and go take a walk, go for a hike. You have to be a little careful because they can move around and things. But if you can keep them still on a person's head, anything you can do while keeping it fixed to a person's head, you're going to get decent signal. And so we now have done a series of studies where we have people sitting across a table just like this having conversations. And we look at the sort of neural synchrony patterns and try to draw sort of conclusions. And some of what we see looks just like what we would predict from, the other studies where, people, for instance, people have more neural synchrony if we are asking them to have a friendly conversation than a conflict conversation. So we bring people in who have different political ideologies, and we'll have them talk about the thing they disagree about, talk about immigration, talk about, transgender sports related issues, things like that. And we'll have them talk about that. And then before or after that, we'll have them talk about something kind of very pleasant and comfortable and so on. And you'll see more synchrony during the sort of more bonding type conversation than during the conflict conversation, just like we would expect. But we have studies where we also look at whether someone is having a shallow versus deep conversation. And we look at the synchrony you get there. And sometimes we see more neural synchrony in the shallow than the deep. That's not really what we expected. But within both the shallow and the deep, I think our basic finding, we're analyzing this data now, so I'm literally thinking of a spreadsheet that I was looking at 3 days ago. I think whether it's shallow or deep, I think it is the case, the more synchrony you have, the more you say at the end of the conversation that you feel connected to the other person. So there's complexity, there's nuance. It's not necessarily shocking that you might get more synchrony in a simple, shallow conversation than a deep conversation. There's going to be more variability in the deep conversations.
That doesn't surprise me, actually, in the sense of like, you might have a friendship that is completely exhausting because all you do is like talk about deep stuff. And so it could be fun to just like, oh, we're watching, the Lakers play right now. And, it's
and these are
shallow,
strangers.
But,
These are two complete strangers who come in. And so there's also something very daunting about having, the deep conversations ask you to get into real stuff with a complete stranger. Now, there's old work showing that if you get into real stuff with a complete stranger, there's pretty decent odds that at the end of that conversation, you're going to feel genuinely connected to that person. We've had people walk out arm in arm and they're new friends and they want to go do stuff together. So like it's called the fast friends paradigm. It's an old thing that Art Aaron came up with decades ago for how to make friends quickly. But I think it can also totally backfire where it's like, something about this person gives me the ick, and now I have to talk to them about the last time I cried in front of someone. So like it could really go different ways. Whereas shallow, it's simple, it's straightforward. We all know that script. And so it might just be easier to get entrained to each other.
Well, you have to have trust, safety. Like, it's easier
It's
if
a
you have that. Yeah.
combination of you need to have it, but also it builds it. The act of doing it builds trust and safety. But obviously, if you already have trust and safety, it makes it easier. So it's a weird kind of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing to try to get the deep conversation to work. So we're interested in like, how do you maximize that? How do you make that deep conversation something that's more likely to lead to good things rather than an awkward conversation? But we're just at the beginning of doing that kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating, the belief system stuff. I mean, that's a difficult thing for me because, and this kind of ties back to some of the stuff you talked about in social, but just the way we develop our belief systems to begin with. And you're writing about how like odd it is that we like easily shift our attitudes along with the masses. So a lot of our own personal identity and how we think of ourselves and what we believe actually kind of isn't really our own. It's like a constellation of things that we're hearing and people are saying to us. And so, there's this divide when it comes to like, oh, I can't be friends or I can't be, someone of a different belief or believe something very radically. We're speaking now in the Democratic National Convention's going on.
Yeah, like literally this second.
Yeah, and
like
so,
Obama's probably talking right now.
And so there's this political commentator, Charlie Kirk, who's he's just going around, and kind of exit on a little bit, but he's posting stuff on Twitter about him being there, and it's kind of like this homogenous thing of like when people that are Democrats go up to him, it's like he's like the enemy,
right?
So I think it's interesting is that like if there is some level of disagreement between two people, right? Can they actually, I know you're early study with this, but like, can they actually develop a deep, meaningful friendship if maybe they don't like spar on that all the time, or they just like leave it be? Because if the end result of like, let's just say synchrony happens is more easily with people that believe the same things, then you get something that's like a very homogenous society of like, we're going to be like in our little tribes and we don't want to interact. And so I'm referencing more of like a social problem, social thing that's going on right now, and even the way we treat people of differing beliefs. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, so many. Yeah, there was lots and lots of different things in there. We don't have to be close friends with everyone. I think the bigger problem when it comes to our ideological divide is that we think everyone on the other side is the devil or disingenuous. We think the worst.
Yeah.
And the really, really hard thing is, like, I study this for a living. I lecture about this. I'm writing a book about parts of this. Literally, I was working on it before I came here today. And I still have that reaction to some people on the opposite side. I think I maybe have it less than some other people, but it's still there. And this really goes back to the way we see the world. We take it as an objective readout of what's in the world. And we don't understand all the ways that what we see is layered with bits from all of our prior experiences and even things in our immediate context. So the metaphor that I like to use is like a heads-up display, augmented reality type thing, right? So we've all seen in science fiction things, or now in some actual cars, there'll be sort of a heads-up display that comes on your sort of windshield that kind of shows things like, the path you should take directly on the road. And it kind of looks painted onto reality, but it's just a projection on your dashboard, right? So what a HUD, a heads-up display, does is it sort of like highlights important things in a very sort of easily visually digestible code, so that you don't have to think about it. You just get it. It's immediately intuitive what it's showing you. And what we don't understand is that our basic seeing is already a series of heads-up displays. It's like we're already wearing the Apple Vision Pro all the time that accentuates some things, hides others. And for many of those things, it's going to do it exactly the same way for virtually everyone.
Like what?
Well, so like for 92% of human beings, we all, as far as we know, pretty much see the color spectrum the same way. And then you've got 8% of people who in one way or another are colorblind. right? They literally see things differently. This is one of my favorite examples. We just sort of think, oh, well, there's different colored things out there, and that's just something that exists out in the world. Of course, color does not exist. There are wavelengths of light that hit objects in the world, bounce and hit our retinas, and then somewhere in our brain, that gets converted into a subjective experience of blue or red or orange or whatever it is. But that doesn't exist out in the world. And we're actually some of the only creatures that actually see reds, yellows, and oranges, right? So just like 8% of humans are red-green colorblind, where they can't see reds, yellows, and oranges, almost every other species out there can't see red, yellows, and oranges. So if you think of seeing color as a heads-up display, why did our brain get us to be able to see reds, yellows, and oranges when most primate brains, our closest cousins, they don't see that, okay? It lets us see fresh fruit from not fresh fruit, which was massively important as humans were developing larger brains relative to their body size compared to all the other animals. It turns out that as fruit becomes ripe, which is when it has the most calories, the most energy to give you, it changes not its color, but the light it reflects. And so our eyes adapted to, just like a heads-up display, be able to immediately see all the things that have the color of ripeness, which means this is going to give you the most calories, the most bang for your buck. But everything in our seeing is like that. We tend to think that we're getting kind of a dot for dot representation of what's in the world on some kind of like screen inside our head. But that's not what our sort of brain does at all. It's always sort of highlighting the things that are most important. You may or may not realize this, but outside of a tiny space like this, for wherever you're looking at the time, your brain isn't processing color and the rest of that. It just assumes it knows what the color is because earlier I looked over there, so the green of that plant over there is sort of in my expectation. But when I'm looking here, and if my attention is really here, it's not being represented as green, which is the same trick that VR headsets are currently learning to do foveated rendering, where it only does high resolution right where you look, and everything else is blurry. But as long as it can shift quickly enough to give you high resolution wherever you look, you don't know the difference. Our brain does the exact same thing with many features of our seeing. And then this extends to things that are more abstract. Because what happens is, over a lifetime of experiences, as being a member of a particular culture or a member of a particular ideology, or people who are taught in a particular school, you're being trained for what your basic expectations are about what's in the world. And your brain uses that to sort of fill in what it sees whenever there's any ambiguity.
Well, there's a social judgment that comes as well, because it's like, if I see things differently than you do, it's like, well, how is that? How could you not see things the same way?
So that's the thing, is if you mistake your heads-up display for being an open window to reality, which we all do. If you think you're looking at reality, I'm looking at reality right now and I see it as it is. It's just so obvious. Like, it's not something I would ever have to stop and question. I see reality as it is. And then you come along and say, that's not what I see. Then my only response, I use the word crapid to describe how how we describe people who don't see things the same way that we do, which is a combination of crazy and stupid, right? That's crapid. We have all these sorts of negative attributions for people who don't see things the way we do, because it's not about my thoughts about those things. It's about the fundamental thing itself. And we don't understand that we're not just taking a veridical picture of reality, but that we are creating the picture from some input from the world and a lot of input from what's already in your brain. You combine those things, but then your brain tells you the output of that is just what's out there. And so when we look at, someone who's homeless, and one person looks at them and immediately experiences them in terms of what horrible circumstances have befallen them, and somebody else looks at them
Which
and
is
says,
empathy,
and somebody else looks at that same person and, just immediately experiences someone as being delinquent and, not
disgusting,
yeah. those are things that we see. We don't have to think them. They're the way we visually experience them. The best example I give, I think, is that we don't see snakes and then decide they're dangerous. We see dangerous snakes. The danger is part of what we see in the same way that the yellow is part of the fruit that we see. They're both added internally. It's just in one case, it's a visual feature. In the other case, it's something that we just immediately know when seeing it. But I think it's the same underlying process.
So how much of our belief system do you feel like is socially inherited, in the sense of like, whatever you like, someone might be voting for Kamala or Donald Trump, whatever. It's like, how much of like what we believe in our identity is actually like socially influenced, which I think is a big deal, because if you're judging another person based on how they see the world,
yeah,
it's just like there's like not actually that much control.
Right. It's just their social history compared to yours.
Yes.
Right. So like that's the whole thing about a book like Hillbilly Elegy or something like that, is that it tries to give you a window into where the views and beliefs of somebody growing up in Appalachia would come from, which to the extent that that's successful, that's really, really powerful. But here's the question, like, where else would your beliefs come from? Like you could say, oh, well, like I read a lot of philosophy. Okay, that's dead people talking to you. Like that's all philosophy is for the most part, is you're just reading what people said before they were dead, but it's still other people saying this is the way things are, or this is the way things should be. And I think the difference is that we hit a certain age and maybe we have a bit more ability to filter what it is that we're going to sort of let into our system versus not. When you're a little kid, it's just what you're exposed to. And I think that you don't do a lot of judging, is that true or not, when you're 4 years old, 5 years old, 7 years old. Yeah. So what you see your parents do, what you see your teachers do, there's like evidence that, a lot of, like, for instance, gender biases that most human beings still have at some implicit level. A lot of that comes from watching how your grade school teachers treated people in the classroom. How did they treat the people who were dressed better, higher SES, socioeconomic status, compared to the people who looked more poor? How did they treat people who were black versus white? And it's really subtle, nonverbal things like I ask for the answer to a long division problem. And there were studies done back in the 70s. One of my advisors in grad school did some of these studies where they would look at a teacher sort of asking a hard question, and what they would find is that if the teacher asked a girl or someone who wasn't dressed as well or someone who was non-white, they would give them a second. The kid would say, I don't know. And the teacher would immediately move on to someone else. And then they would get to sort of the white boy and say, oh, so what's the answer to this problem? And they would say like, well, I'm not sure. And they would say, well, try to think it out, right? Just like a little bit of like just basic encouragement to say like, you can get there. And everybody is seeing that without knowing how that's getting encoded into their default mode network about the way the world works, because you're too young to say like, hey, I reject that behavior. A 6-year-old, a 7-year-old isn't going to do that. It's just reality. Like, this is just reality. The reality is that white boys get this and black girls get that, right? It's just a fact of what happens. And there are parameters being set in your brain. I don't know that I'd call them beliefs, but they're associations. And those associations,
unconscious.
Yeah, definitely unconscious, non-conscious. And those are then going to shape what you see 30 years later. And it's not that you're endorsing it or not endorsing it. It's not a belief. It's an association, but it's going to shape then what you see as just the open window to reality. And you don't know that you've shaped that at all. So then when you and I see that differently, you obviously have something broken in you for you to not see things the way I do. Because I know I see things the way they are. So what other, explanation is there for you not seeing it?
Yeah, I think people just understanding this is like very helpful to navigating the social world. Yeah. And so.
I mean, I think one of the key things, and I have this whole chapter in this book I'm working on right now that's called Anti-Affirmations. And the whole chapter is about you know, I don't know if you remember watch Saturday Night Live back, years ago, but there was Al Franken used to do this character, Stu Smalley, where he would sit on stage and he was kind of like a motivational speaker, and he would say, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like you. And he would say this to himself in the mirror. And it's this whole culture of like, I need to make myself feel better about myself. I need to tell myself that I'm okay and I can do and go for whatever I want. And the idea of anti-affirmations is to actually sort of instill greater humility and say, there's all these things we do that are bad habits that lead us to be far more confident in the way we see the world than we should be. And so the whole chapter is just sort of a series of things. Like anytime you start a sentence with a word like, of course, check yourself, because there's probably you're making assumptions that are not based on the sort of necessary facts of the world, but just the way you're predisposed to see the world. And so there's just a variety of those that I think are really, really important to just kind of play through your mind to remind yourself of the part you play in what you see, so that you can then be open to, because like if somebody else sees the world differently, like a much better response would be like, tell me about that. That's so interesting. What in your past experience led you to see it that way? And let me think about what in my past experience might have led me to see things the way I do. If you really, really take a deep understanding that it's not a window that's opening, but we each have different software installed, then it's like, oh, I'm curious about your software. And like, what benefits could I get from understanding yours? Because I'm limited by the way I see the world. And we do this a little. We do this with musicians and other celebrities who we cherish for seeing the world differently than we do and showing us a different way of seeing. But it's a very small little segment where we somehow have carved it out and said that's safe to like appreciate them for seeing painters and, and artists of different kinds. But for everyday folks, it's almost always like, what is wrong with you? And, the real question is, why am I seeing things the way I am? How do I understand that better?
Yeah. We had kind of an expert on here talking about this, and he called curiosity like a superpower in the sense of like how it really just like disarms people, even if you were like completely opposite ideologically. And so I think that's really important kind of takeaway that people can get. I kind of wanted to close with a little bit more like rapid fire questions on social connection, friendship. How many connections would you recommend that someone needs for their emotional well-being, and like how would you split that? We talked about the Arthur Brooks categories, but just across categories.
I mean, I don't think there's a number, and I think that differs for introverts and extroverts. So for instance, if I was guessing, I would guess that an introvert needs like 3 in that top category and maybe almost none in the bottom category. And an extrovert probably still needs 1 in that top category, and decent chance it'll be a spouse. But they probably need dozens in that bottom category, right? So I think it really, so I think there are real differences in how we want to use those buckets, or whatever buckets I would actually end up with if I gave it a lot of thought.
Yeah. Is there like a maximum amount of like social connections that we can actually like coherently, cognitively give our time to?
I mean, there's this famous thing from Robin Dunbar where he said the number is like 150, and he looks at history and he shows that like between 100 and 200 is the level at which we often start dividing up a new way. So rather than growing an organization to 300 or 400, we'll split it into 2 and give them separate kind of identities. So, there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest there's something to that. And you can, and I talk about this in the book, although I don't remember the numbers, but if you think about in every group that you're in, you have to be successful, you have to basically be able to map what all the different sort of like dyadic and triadic relationships are between all the people in that group. I need to know who's friends with who's scared of who is interested in whom romantically, and all those things. And the number of things you have to keep track of grows exponentially as you add more people to the group. Because each person you add is a whole new set of dyadic and triadic relationships with every other possible combination that's already there. And so it grows massively.
You see this with CEOs. I mean,
yeah.
So,
So there seems to be some sort of mental tax from trying to do this in larger and larger groups.
Yeah, that's good. For the person who kind of just moved to a new city, college, or even if they're sitting here, they just don't have very many friends. Like, what would you say is a good place to start in trying to develop meaningful social connections?
I mean, hopefully in a few years, my company, because that's exactly what we are focused on.
Yeah.
And, using this sort of ideas that I talked about with seeing and synchrony and so on, we have developed an app where we can predict with pretty good accuracy who will sort of make real connections if they get a chance to talk and chat. And so we use this with colleges for people who haven't even started college yet so that they can show up on campus having already made a few connections. But I think the same thing applies to every other moment in life when you've got to find new people. So you move to a new city, you start a new job, whatever that case may be. We think, we joke about how, Facebook, we think of it as a way that people connect, but Facebook has almost never helped anyone make new connections.
Yeah.
And the sort of app that we have, the company is Resonance. Our app actually really sort of helps people sort of make new connections. So that's sort of the self-interested advice I would give.
Yeah.
But the less self-interested advice I think that I would give is that you have to put yourself out there and you have to put yourself in a yes mindset. So I think that it's pretty anxiety provoking to put yourself out there, at least for folks who aren't the most extroverted. It's pretty daunting because, you can get rejected by anyone when you put yourself out there with new people. And so you have to put yourself into a yes mindset where if someone suggests going and doing something and it's not something that's usually on your dance card for things to go do, if you're looking to make new connections, try and see if you can say yes. And, if it goes well, then you've just learned something new and interesting about yourself. But this is the only way to sort of get to new connections is you've got to go do things with people, I think, and have experiences with them. And I don't think it can just be talk with each other.
Yeah.
I think you have to bring things into your lives that are a common focal point of things you've done together, experiences you've had with other people. And so you've got to go do those things. And then the other thing, especially for guys, is when there are opportunities to share something that feels a little bit scary, do it. Make the choice to do it instead of not doing it, because it won't always open doors, but it will more than you think. And that's the other thing that really sort of creates bonds is actual disclosure. Because when I feel like I can see inside the way you process things, that allows me to sort of feel like I trust and know you and understand you, and also map the extent to which we do that similarly. If you talk about some difficult experience in your life, the other person will almost always zero in on the part that they share with you, not the part that makes you different from them. And so by sharing something deeper that you went through, you're giving other people an opportunity to find a deeper way to understand that you have something in common.
That's really good. I love when there's overlap in terms of some of the fields and data and guests we had on, because Arthur had talked about like a shared love and kind of related to the idea of what you're talking about, the importance of having experiences or some kind of thing that's outside of the relationship that you're doing together. And
But it can also be shared hates.
Yeah.
I think actually shared hates are an easier way to initially bond than shared loves. If we both hate the same music, or we go see a movie and we both just cannot stand the movie, there is something delicious about that, because it tends to put you, especially if it puts you in the minority. So this movie, The English Patient, came out a million years ago. And I went to it. I could tell I was with 8 other people and they were all crying throughout the movie. And I just thought the movie was one long perfume ad. Like I couldn't stand it. And the next day I talked to someone who similarly hated the movie, and that won the Oscar that year. Like people love that movie, but the fact that I shared this dislike of this thing that everyone else liked, it was so distinctive. It was like, you're like me. It was a really strong indicator. Whereas if we had both liked that movie, it tells us a lot less about ourselves because everyone else liked that movie. So having sort of a shared way of seeing things differently than most people do, maybe that's what I would point to as the most important thing.
Yeah. And last two, so what about handling rejection? Any tips there?
Yeah. I mean, most of the advice, it rings hollow when you're going through it, for sure. This guy I used to work with at the Neuro Leadership Institute, David Rock, he talked about thinking about experiences in terms of before, during, and after. And I think during a lot of experiences, there's not a lot of in the moment kind of audibles that we can call to change how we're reacting. We sort of get entrained into what's happening in the moment. And the real place that you can do your work is before and after those experiences. So it's almost like you have to have a plan before you go into some experience. And then after you've had an experience, you kind of have to sort of do a post-mortem on that and say, like, what would I do differently next time? Who do I need to write notes to apologize for how I behaved when I got crazy in that moment, whatever it is. And so, the rejection-related stuff, I mean, some of it's trite. Time helps, for sure. It really does. It's hard in the moment to believe that. In some ways, my advice would be not so much for the person who just got rejected, but for the people close to that person, which is, that person is like hurting more than they're going to let on most of the time. And they really need other people to sort of fill that void until they sort of emotionally get back on their feet. And I think, to the extent that you can think of that rejection as, okay, so now I have an opportunity and a space to think about doing things differently and thinking about what am I going to do with that space and that time. For me, when I went through sort of the biggest rejection of my life, it was horrible for months. And then at some point it was like, I now have extra space in my life. I have extra time. What do I want to do with that? And I made like strategic, intentional choices about what I wanted to do with my time. I was in my, mid-20s, so was still in that sort of like self-discovery period of time. But I made decisions to sort of invest in various things, and it really, paid dividends for me. Obviously, sort of knowing that it fades with time and that you just have to sort of know that you're going to get back to a place of connecting with other people, because, there's 8 billion people on the planet, most of who want connections. You're going to find other people to connect with, but it's a hard, messy process. And, as they say in Philadelphia, you got to trust the process. So
that's good. And yeah, last one, what would you say to somebody who's lost hope for social connections? Maybe they're cynical, maybe they're paint this outlook like, I'm not going to develop any friendships, or this is just the way people are. What would you say to that person?
I mean, look, I believe everyone has a right to make the choices they want to make. I don't think that person should be forced into anything. But I would say they're probably making decisions that are going to, in total, cause them to have, a less happy, positive, meaningful experience. So much of our genuine meaning in life comes out of the connections we have with others. This is going back to the beginning of our discussion when we talked about Abraham Maslow's pyramid. The top of the pyramid is self-actualization. And we think about self-actualization, like I think the image that always used to come to mind for me was like, I'm going to be a painter now. I'm going to use my free time to paint what's in my mind. But I think that as I become an adult, what I've learned is that for most people, self-actualization has to do with meaning, and meaning comes from what you do for others. There's very few things that genuinely feel meaningful if it's just for you and contained just in your own space. Meaning comes from how we sort of help and do and teach for others. And so I actually think the highest sort of point on the self-actualization ladder is really about not social rewards that come to you, but what do you do for others, which then make you feel a richer sort of sense of things in the world.
It's really good. Well, thank you, Matthew.
Sure.
Appreciate the conversation. So much fascinating insights, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a ton out of this. So I just appreciate your time today.
No, that was fun. Yeah, that was good.